Yael Sela from the Open University of Israel. Yael Sela has recently been appointed Assistant Professor of Musicology at the Open University of Israel. She's a member of the researcher group המקום at the Hebrew University. Since the completion of her doctoral studies in musicology at Oxford in 2010, she has held research fellowships at the Hebrew University, Humboldt University of Berlin, Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where we met. Her research on music in German Jewish intellectual and cultural history in the 18th and early 19th century, as well as her work on domestic music and manuscript culture in early modern England, has appeared, for example, in the Jewish Quarterly Review and Renaissance Studies. She is currently preparing a monograph on music and aesthetics in the work of Moses Mendelssohn and its reception, and we had the pleasure to hear a bit of that at the last conference of our group, Princeton, and she's co-editing with Philip Bollman a volume entitled Voices of Displacement, Music and Memory in the Jewish Experience of Modernity. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you also, Jana, and and Leora for inviting me to continue, basically, my paper from last year from Princeton, in a way, with this one. Is this just right? Okay. 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 The funeral cantata Sulamite Neusebia, written in memory of Moses Mendelssohn in 1786, a few weeks after his death, by the Enlightenment poet Karl Wilhelm Ramler, is an intricately woven hermeneutical poem that laments the death of the Jewish philosopher from Berlin and celebrates every aspect of his philosophical, aesthetic, and political theological project. The only elegy in memory of Mendelssohn that was ever set to music, and that by a Jewish composer, Bernhard Wessely, nephew of the Hebrew poet Naftali Herz. The inception and performances of the piece were the fruit of a Jewish-Christian commemoration endeavor whose uniqueness attests to the political optimism that the interreligious encounter in Mendelssohn's circles of the Berliner Aufklärung upheld. Written as a dirge song of two allegorical figures, the Hebraic Sulamite, the Shulamite, and the Greek Ezekiah, accompanied by a chorus evocative of the daughters of Zion, the cantata evolves around the exegetical axis of the Book of Lamentations and the Song of Songs, embodied in the figure of Sulamite, the biblical beloved turned desolate Jerusalem. And I had to think yesterday when Ruth Kara told us about the birth of the heavenly bride at the moment of destruction, I had to think about my Sulamite, but that's a different story, that's a different conference. While the cantata is largely dominated by biblical poetics of destruction, in the epilogue of the piece, the voice of Sulamite interrupts the impassioned lament and summons the community, both the dramatic and the real one, to cease from mourning and to join her in singing what Mendelssohn now sings. And now, companions, mourn our friend no more. Sing with me what he now sings and what the king of our people sang to him before. I walked through the valley of the shadow of death and walked there without fear, for my God was with me. Bliss and happiness have followed me in my first life. Now I rest forever in the house of the Eternal One. Quoting Psalm 23, which we heard this morning read beautifully in Mendelssohn's translation, the librettist Ramler sets Mendelssohn's voice as an echo, or better still, perhaps a continuation, of the voice of the psalmist on Mount Zion. As we see in the preceding passage, where Sulamite says, addressing Mendelssohn, "Now converse with your David," and so on. "He whose fiery songs you repeated here, but in a colder language, now sings with you in a loftier tone the praise of the Godhead, whom he and you have loved, whom he praised on Mount Zion, whom you have taught the world." The epilogue introduces then a modulation, to use a musical term, from the mournful key of destruction to a redemptive key, a transition that is explicitly announced in Sulamite's prophetic voice Unfortunately, the score has been lost, so we can only imagine how this may have been realized in music. Here, the Protestant rambler not only departs from the commonplace use of Psalm 23 in Luther's classic translation as a funeral reading. He explicitly frames the psalm as a song, heard in Mendelssohn's voice within the dramatic reality of the cantata. So when we think about dramatic musical works such as oratorios or operas, or in this case a cantata, the figures are not aware of the fact that they're singing. They have a dramatic reality within the piece. When a song is sung within that reality, it's a song within a song, as it were, and then they are aware of it. What's more, Rambler boldly paraphrases the verses of the psalm through a grammatical manipulation to the past tense. I walked through the valley and walked there without fear, instead of, though I walk, I will fear no evil. As well as in my first life, instead of the original in Mendelssohn's translation, in this life, in diesem Leben. This manipulation does several things. It underscores the distinctness of the song within the piece as a song sung by someone, by subject. It, more specifically, invokes the voice of Mendelssohn's immortal soul heard from eternity, which creates a temporal continuum between the first life under divine providence and the salvation of the soul in the afterlife. What is then the hermeneutical meaning of this epilogue? And how can we understand the performative role of the psalm as a song sung by Mendelssohn within the dramatic realm that the cantata delineates between a desolate, mournful Jerusalem, Sulamit, a sympathetic Athens, Eusebius, and the psalmist heard on Mount Zion? I would like to suggest that the epilogue constitutes a musical poetic dramatization of Mendelssohn's philosophical conception of the Psalms as universal yet genuinely Jewish sacred poetry. Mendelssohn did not write a commentary on Psalms, nor did he leave a comprehensive description of the intention behind his translation, which was published in 1783. Perhaps the most intriguing indication is found in another one of his most important works, published that very same year, the political theological essay Jerusalem, or on religious power in Judaism. In Jerusalem, verses from the Psalms are interpolated at significant climactic points in the argument. They are explicitly quoted there as the words of the psalmist himself, just as Psalm 23 is markedly announced by Sulamit as coming directly out of the mouth of Mendelssohn. In what follows, I will draw upon the epilogue of the cantata Sulamit and Eusebius as a key for exploring the performative deployment of psalms in the second part of Mendelssohn's Jerusalem. I will attempt to understand how it, in turn, attests to Mendelssohn's conception of psalms and of his own translation. Finally, I will only touch upon the question of place and redemption. Where is Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, and what sort of redemption might the cantata allude to? Mendelssohn's translation of the Book of Psalms was dedicated to no other than his Lutheran friend and interlocutor in literary matters, Rambler. By contrast to his German translation of the Pentateuch in Hebrew characters with Hebrew commentary, which was intended exclusively for a Jewish readership, the Psalms translation appeared in German characters without any commentary and was intended for a broad non-Jewish readership. Largely instigated by the attack made around 1770 by the Swiss theologian Laffer, Mendelssohn aimed to produce a non-partisan translation that would present the Psalms as a document of natural religion for Christians and Jews alike, free from all prophetic and messianic interpretations, Jewish or Christian. In a letter to his friend Elisa Reimarus, written shortly after the publication appeared, Mendelssohn remarks that the Psalms do not contain what Christians and Jews have until now been looking for with so much criticism and erudition. Mendelssohn's exegetical approach, giving attention to the literal meaning and aesthetic qualities of Scripture, as opposed to mystical and prophetic interpretations, was guided by an aspiration to rational edification that would promote universal religiosity. This approach is voiced already in his first discussion of biblical poetry, published in 1757, in the review of Lectures on the Sacred Poetry of the Hebrews by Robert Loaf. Locating the origins of Hebrew poetry in music, Mendelssohn renders the Psalms the supreme and most ancient example of songs of devotion and praise of the divine. And I read selectively. The Hebrews alone offer the earliest examples of poetic hymns in praise of God. Under the reign of King David, the art of music and poetry reached its highest degree. 4,000 singers alternately sang hymns in the temple, and so on. In this and subsequent writings, Mendelssohn, following Lowth, construes biblical poetry as quintessentially sublime, the aesthetic category by which we represent the immeasurable and experience awe. Music itself was to Mendelssohn a divine art whose edifying potential is linked with the aesthetic, emotional, and ethical experience associated with the sublime. In the Lowth Review, he asserts that the divine poets among the ancient Hebrews were able to arouse the most sublime sensations in us and knew how to make their way directly to our hearts. Moreover, the topics that make songs sublime, God, his creation, and eternity, thus make songs a compendium of natural religion, to use David Sorkin's phrase. Mendelssohn therefore found in the songs the most adequate response to the divine, proof of Judaism's inherent enlightenment, and an eminently suitable universal source of edification. Once available in a nonpartisan German translation that revealed the aesthetic qualities of Hebrew poetry according to sense and rhythm, songs would be a primer of universal religiosity. Now, as I said earlier, some songs receive a prominent place in Mendelssohn's essay Jerusalem, published the very same year as the translation of songs. A political theological defense of Judaism as natural religion, Jerusalem was similarly written in response to a theological charge made the previous year by August Kranz, that Judaism sanctions religious coercion. Against this charge, Jerusalem defends Judaism as a synthesis of rational universal religious truths, or what Mendelssohn calls eternal truth, God's existence, divine providence, and the immortality of the soul, with revealed, particularly Jewish, ritual law and moral freedom. By contrast to Christianity, Judaism knows of revealed legislation, which he calls a historical truth, in the form of the commandments of the Torah, rather than a revealed religion in the sense of revealed dogmas whose confession is required for salvation. In Judaism, the eternal truths needed for salvation are available to all, not only Jews, through reason, and must be accepted freely on the basis of rational conviction. Obedience to Jewish law coheres both with the Aristotelian and Maimonidean concept of intellectual perfection and with the ideals of political liberty and religious tolerance. Intellectual perfection, shlemut hanefesh, is furthermore the ultimate goal of religious life. It constitutes the highest form of divine worship, which can be achieved by Jews and Gentiles alike. Throughout the second part of Jerusalem, where these themes are discussed, verses from Psalms are quoted at climactic points, as if to buttress key arguments. Let us take a look, and I will restrict myself to 2 examples in the interest of time. So, responding at the outset of Jerusalem to his adversary's charge that obedience to revealed Jewish law is based on fear of punishment rather than reason, Mendelssohn cries out against the mere possibility the mere possibility of subordinating reason to faith. And I quote, "Authority can humble, but not instruct. It can suppress reason, but not put it in fetters." Reason would always raise its head in the form of doubts that would resolve themselves into childlike prayers. To nail the argument, Mendelssohn quotes the psalmist with verse 3 of Psalm 43. And I will let you read it, but the important line to me is that he starts with, "I would call out with the psalmist, 'Lord, send me your light, your truth,'" and so on. Mendelssohn is neither willing to abandon his love of God, nor is he able to deny reason. Religious action without rational conviction is of no religious value. The two are inseparable. Mendelssohn joins the psalmist's words to assert that God is truth, and his divine providence a source of infinite solace. In a different place, Mendelssohn proclaims, "Judaism boasts of no exclusive revelation of eternal truths, which are indispensable to salvation. Eternal truths are the universal religion of mankind, not Judaism. Yet, eternal truths are nonetheless one of the core components of Judaism, next to revealed legislation and commandments. Without eternal truths," he notes, "man cannot be enlightened and happy." Moreover, the eternal truths were not revealed in script. And I quote again, "The Supreme Being," he writes, has revealed them to all rational creatures through things and concepts, and inscribed them in the soul with a script that is legible and comprehensible at all times and in all places. And once again, he turns to the words heard in the voice of the psalmist. For this reason, our much-quoted poet sings, heavens declare the majesty of God, and the firmament announces the work of his hands, and so on. Mendelssohn seems to be saying here that the Psalms are not mere words in script. They are sublime representation, embodied in the voice of the psalmist, of those things and concepts, such as nature, God's creation. Their effect, he continues, is as universal as the benefit influence of the sun, which sheds light and warmth over the whole globe. And once again, the same poet-singer appears. From sunrise to sundown, the name of the Eternal is praised. But if the Psalms are a source of knowledge about eternal truths, how will this knowledge be of use to man? How will the enlightened person seeking self-improvement, tikkun, and perfection, shlemut nefesh, obtain these truths on his way to salvation? It seems to me that the verses quoted from Psalms in Jerusalem constitute more than plain textual references. The repeated pattern by which Mendelssohn introduces the same voice of the psalmist, the poet, the singer, to buttress his argument, seem to suggest that he hears it, and more so that we are expected to hear the words rather than merely read them. Hear the voice of the psalmist singing the divine words of eternal truth as instances of vocal enactment. We are reminded here of Mendelssohn's conception of the inherently musical nature of the art of biblical poetry, to which the Loth Review already alluded. The notion of the power of music wedded with biblical poetry, like the idea of living script of the Torah, is fully explored in the Hebrew commentary on the Pentateuch, published in 1782. In the introduction to Exodus 15, Song of the Sea, Mendelssohn fully develops this idea and adds that music serves the end desired in poetry, namely, that the words enter not only the listener's ear, but also his heart. They should remain engraved on the tablets of his heart, moving his sentiments according to the intended meaning, and firmly establish within him the virtues and excellent dispositions, like goads and nails that have been planted, like a stake that will not dislodge. And since the pleasantness of poetry and pleasing music contribute greatly to meeting this need and promoting this end, and so on, our ancestors chose to order their noble phrases according to a beautiful order that agrees with the art of music. The aesthetics of Hebrew poetry is intended both as a memorizing aid and for preserving the meaning of the words, what he calls the sweetness of content. Indeed, the art of music and poetry of the ancient Hebrews bears no resemblance to what we know today. That's what he says. By contrast to contemporary music and poetry, which is concerned primarily with what is pleasant to the senses, in ancient times, the purpose of the art was to subdue the faculties of the soul and transform it, its dispositions, according to its will. This description, in Hebrew, resonates with the much earlier fragmentary letters on art, written in German, where Mendelssohn stipulated on the power of words wedded with music. The purpose of this inestimable art, music, is to make the effect of poetry in our mind more emphatic, more vital, and more passionate. When a song in praise of God, of wisdom, or of virtue is sung with the appropriate energy, inspired by an accompanying instrument, it completely governs our sentiments. Here, too, music is given the role of explicating the meaning of words and effect the right moral sentiment accordingly. As the passage continues in an almost ecstatic crescendo, the rational perception of the sung words masters our soul, and the pleasantness of the tones through which the words are carried puts our senses into the state of the affect, the emotion that they are supposed to arouse. The excitement becomes total. We are simultaneously pulled away against our will, accompanied by joy and delight on our way to happiness. Back to Exodus 15, to the commentary on Exodus 15, the ultimate purpose of sacred poetry to Mendelssohn is guidance toward eternal felicity and true flourishing by means of the elevated and lofty content, including blessings and songs praising the eternal that that lead man to eternal life. In a letter written only a few days before his death, Mendelssohn gives his Protestant friend, Sophie Becker, religious advice that reveals his conception of the relationship between singing songs and enlightenment. Every person, I believe, sings not so that God will hear him and like his melodies. We sing for our own sake, and that the wise man does as well as the fool. Have you ever read the Psalms with this intention? It seems to me that many of the songs are of that kind, sung by the most enlightened person. They must effect true edification. I would recommend to you my translation. So much is beyond doubt. The songs have sweetened for me many bitter hours, and I pray and sing them whenever I feel in me the need to pray and sing. His advice in this letter suggests that the justification for the religious act, particularly that of singing songs, is closely related to the truth of natural religion, independent of our belief in God. The religious practice is not determined by the divine object, but by the human response to the divine. Alas, only few among the intended readership of Mendelssohn's translation of songs understood the intention behind it. In 1786, Mendelssohn's confidant David Friedlander published in the Berlinische Monatsschrift a defense of the Psalms translation, which is at the same time a bill of indictment against Protestant Bible scholars and theologians, the Tellers, Herders, and Eichhorns, as he sneers, who ought to have grabbed the translation with desiring fingers. And again, I will read only very selectively. He refers to the translation of these old and venerable monuments of philosophy and poetry, in which the original has lost so little or no energy and succinctness, as little as tone and color. Only he, Mendelssohn, could have presented everything exactly in the spirit of the original script. In particular, he has recommended the concepts of God and the divine, the wisdoms of pure worship and moral conduct of people, of which the Psalms contain such a wealthy treasure. And the last sentence, now one can quite accurately recognize the degree of enlightenment already reached at the time of the royal singer. However, most of the readers, Friedlander deplores, never wanted to grasp the intention behind the translation, even though Mendelssohn quite explicitly indicated it in his Jerusalem. Indeed, Mendelssohn indicated his intention not in words and script in Jerusalem, but by way of performed exempla that should inspire the reader to internally hear the songs, reflect upon, and ultimately reenact his singing. Among the few who did grasp this intention was the poet and librettist Karl Wilhelm Ramler. The epilogue with which I began realizes what Mendelssohn does in Jerusalem by generating a dramatic musical event based on Mendelssohn's philosophical and ethical claim. So, back to the epilogue. When Sulamit summons the community to cease from mourning and join Mendelssohn's singing, she, or Ramler through her, creates a performative moment in which Mendelssohn's voice as subject enacts that ethical claim by following the exemplum of the psalmist on Mount Zion. It constitutes in itself an example of the ethical imperative to sing or chant Psalm 23, an act of edification and enlightenment. Emphatically articulated as a song, and through the grammatical manipulation of the verses, this moment embodies all three eternal truths: God, his providence in the first life, as he calls it, and the immortality of the soul in the second, which we hear singing Psalm 23, as it were. An icon of enlightenment and rational religiosity, Mendelssohn's figure in the cantata takes on the role that the psalmist is given in Jerusalem. If Psalms is a compendium of natural religion, its universality is nonetheless relative. Mendelssohn's translation, as Friedlander well observed, is only universal in its plain, orally transmitted Hebrew, or at least in utmost proximity to it through the right translation. Not the Hebrew that is inscribed in script alone, but that which simultaneously exists orally, or in a translation sensitive to its particular aesthetics. Only in its sublime completeness of script and sound does it bear that sweetness of content which can be imprinted onto the hearts and minds. In other words, the Psalms translation rather underscores the authenticity and irreducibility of Hebrew poetry. After all, to Mendelssohn, the right translation is that which does not seek to blur boundaries of difference, but acknowledges an inherent measure of untranslatability in the translation itself. And finally, a few words on place and redemption. The essay Jerusalem is arguably concerned also with the question of redemption. Gideon Freudenthal, for example, has even suggested that Mendelssohn maintains a messianic notion. But where is Mendelssohn's Jerusalem? And does he really imagine the Jerusalem, the one in which Mount Zion is located, as the place of redemption? Responding to his Christian adversary's hope for a unification of religions under a Christian model of devotion that no longer connects true divine service to either Jerusalem or Samaria, but rather locates the true essence of religion in spirit and in truth, as Christ promises the Samaritan woman in John 4:23. Perhaps Mendelssohn is suggesting a third option. The essence of religion is, after all, located in Jerusalem, but not the one in which Mount Zion is located, where the Levites would one day resume their singing in the rebuilt temple, and in that he differs greatly from Adnan and from all of his early modern and medieval predecessors. Mendelssohn's Jerusalem is a political model of civil liberties and religious pluralism, a utopian upper Jerusalem, if you like, whose ethical essence is encapsulated in the Psalms of David, as Bramler well understood, which can and ought to be heard anywhere, anytime, somewhere between Jerusalem and Athens, starting perhaps on the banks of the river Shpee. Thank you.
We are running a bit late, so I will collect questions if there are any. Yes.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting. I'm wondering, I know this is a big subject, but if you could say something about the translation of Psalms in relationship to the Bior, in the sense of the association of Psalms with eternal truths, as opposed to revealed legislation. And the question of whether or not Mendelssohn in the Psalms, which are translated later than the Bior, am I wrong?
Over 10 years from around 1770 until 1783.
Well, okay. Well, whether or not in the Psalms translation intended for a non-Jewish audience, he deals in any way with the early biblical criticism in the way that he avoids it in the Bior. So those are just, I'm just wondering if, as you know, the giant question about Mendelssohn is the relationship between revealed legislation and eternal truths, a question of whether or not Jewish revelation is at all necessary or particular. And I'm just wondering what you might have to say about Psalm.
Should I answer it?
Yeah, Robert.
I was wondering, in all that you quoted from Mendelssohn about the beautiful music of biblical poetry and of psalms, if, in the perspective of involving intellectual history, the way he thought about biblical poetry wasn't the kind of unintended Trojan horse into the bastion of faith. But listen to this. Basically, he talks about biblical poetry as a didactic vehicle. That is, it moves the emotions, makes the heart tremble, it's intensely pleasurable, and then all that affective cluster leads us to a perception of the rational truths about God. But the heavy emphasis on pleasure and emotion, could that possibly be pointing toward future developments in which those become an end in itself, and poetry of songs is just read as poetry?
Another question.
Just want to ask in relation to these universal, actually Mendelssohn did was to universalize certain ideas. Especially what Mendelssohn actually did is to universalize certain ideas about music that reformist thinkers in the 16th century onward used to say about the role of music in relation to poetry, using some of Rousseau's ideas and others at the time. But the question is, given the fact that he had certain orchestral music in his ears, what sort of music did he have in mind when he thought about this new wedding of the poem of the Bible?
I would love to answer this question first immediately.
Okay. So
I will try to condense it very much. I'm not sure I can fully answer all three questions. They are very big and important. But Ruth, to your question, some of his translated songs were actually composed during his lifetime in Berlin by composers who knew him, and he knew them, and he also heard some of them performed. And I don't think that is the sort of music he had in mind. He actually said it, I quote part of the place where he talks about the difference between contemporary music that we hear today and the music and the sort of pseudo-Platonic idea of the music that he's talking about. On the Sentiments, which was written very early on in 1755 in German, it's an aesthetic essay, he calls music divine art, and he explains why in aesthetic terms, universal terms. When he talks in the Biur about the art of biblical poetry and music in the commentary on the Song of the Sea, he explicitly says, do not be mistaken that this was the sort of music that you know today. It's something completely different. And I think that what he hears is the music that Agnon hears, is the music of the Levites of the temple that is lost forever, but somehow resonates in our poetry still. Sort of this is, I leave it to you to, or for another time to interpret it. To the question on the Biur, in the Biur, but also in Jerusalem later on, he talks about it again, about the concept of living script, right? So the cantillations were given to Moses by God on Sinai, and were passed on to Joshua, and from Joshua to the others, and so on. So I think that the concept of living script is very close to the concept of biblical poetry. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but sort of the revealed legislation is also exists in the way, is in that marriage of words and music, as it were, or in the orality, and it cannot be understood without the cantillations, the meaning of it. I don't know if that answers your question. And finally, I'm not sure that his translation led directly. I think that the fact that songs turned into sort of pure poetry in a way was an interpretation. I don't think that he intended that. The most interesting interpretation that had started in his lifetime and then was published after he had died. The most interesting interpretation of the song's translation is republication, is an edition of the translation in Hebrew characters, published by the Maskil Yoel Brill around 1790, with 3 introductions, which are entirely secular. They're almost scholarly essays on poetics and on the music of biblical time. And there, we can start asking whether songs are becoming mere poetry, pure poetry. At the same time, the title of that edition is Sefer Zmirot Israel, the book of the songs of Israel, which to me sounds sort of almost proto-national, in a way that maintains this connection to Judaism, this inherent connection to Judaism. It's an edition that remained very popular throughout at least first half of the 19th century, if not throughout the 19th century.